They found the box beneath a skin of clay the color of old blood. It was the spring of 1918, a road crew widening a bend outside Somerset, Kentucky, when a shovel rang against iron. Up came a metal coffer, seams soldered tight, and inside, 17 leather-bound books that smelled of tallow and winter cellars. The first page I touched bore a careful hand and a simple rule, repeated at the end of entry after entry. Coffin weighted appropriately. Family none the wiser. Numbers in the margins told a story the living had refused to imagine. 637 bodies sold to distant lecture halls and theaters of anatomy. Beside many names, the inked red cross, not dead when chosen. The book sent me backward, past the roaring motor cars and the papers full of war, to a patch of pine-dark wilderness in eastern Kentucky that the settlers, with frontier bluntness, had called Death Valley. It was not valley so much as clearing. A 5-acre rise where a whitewashed chapel lifted its modest steeple toward a sky full of wheeling hawks. In 1784, 3 brothers stepped into that clearing and set down their belongings as if unrolling a plan someone else had drawn for them. Ezekiel Ashworth, 32, came with a city man's knowledge and an undertaker's unblinking gaze. He had tended the dead in Philadelphia, and he carried with him bottles that caught the light like trapped rain. Marai, silent, clever with dovetail and plane, followed, all wood scents and splinters, a gravedigger by necessity, a carpenter by nature. The youngest, Zachariah, possessed the voice. He was a preacher out of Virginia, handsome, mild-eyed, the kind of man whose hand on a shoulder could be mistaken for benediction when it was sometimes only measurement. They bought the land at the edge of the settlement and named their new cemetery with a verse on the tongue. "The Valley of the Shadow of Death," Zachariah explained, as if Scripture were a lantern and not a curtain. They built the chapel, painted it white, and behind it raised 2 long, low houses that smelled of lye and shavings, Ezekiel's rooms for washing and shrouding, Morai's shop for shaping boards into boxes of consolation. Families brought their dead, and the brothers offered a complete mercy, a service, a coffin, a place in neat rows among the pines. Men left those funerals saying the preacher had a gift, that the undertaker's hands were tender, that the carpenter's joints fit so tightly the rain itself couldn't sneak in. In the ledgers, the first entries are cautious. 8 bodies shipped that first year, packed in crates disguised as tool chests. Sawdust and salt doing quiet work while roads unspooled toward Philadelphia and New York. Payments came back by courier, sealed packets entrusted to merchants who never knew their fingers brushed a crime. On June 17, 1784, Ezekiel wrote, "We provide a service to the living and the dead." On another page in 1785, he added the arithmetic that would undo them all. $23 received. Dr. H requests healed fractures. Must keep watch for appropriate subjects. Watch they did. While Zachariah's sermons taught resignation and resurrection, Ezekiel learned to weigh grief. Families would view their beloved one last time, face revealed, the rest concealed beneath a clean shroud. When the mourners had gone, Ezekiel slid the body through a trap door hidden under the work table into a cellar that breathed cold and secrecy. There he opened a vein to spirits and herbs, stitched the mouth into silence, and nested the form in salt. Upstairs, Morai filled the now empty coffin with rocks and frozen earth measured to the ounce, then sealed the lid with a thin, righteous line of pitch. Zachariah spoke over the grave. The valley received another weight that was not a person. By 1791, the letters arriving from the east no longer asked, but urged. Laws had tightened around the allowed dead. Need swelled. Dr. William Hammond's script leaned forward on the page. $40 per suitable subject. The number bent the brothers' restraint. Why wait for fever or accident, Ezekiel reasoned, when Providence delivered solitary men to their door. The first deliberate taking came on an autumn night when rain slashed the chapel windows and a traveler begged shelter. Zachariah sat him at their table. The wine was warm, the herbs invisible. Male, approximately 30, the ledger reads. Surgical scar. Effect swift. Preservation begun within the hour. From then on, the valley learned to swallow men who had left no maps behind. Travelers along the western road, those with no kin nearby, no name anyone would chase to the ends of the pines, sat at the brothers' table and did not rise from it. Zachariah asked the right questions with a minister's compassion. Ezekiel kept a silent watch at the crossroads. Morai built a cellar with 3 rooms and a door that opened onto the back path no one used unless they meant not to be seen. They refined their mixture so it mimicked the ordinary cruelties of life. They burned papers, scattered coins, and sold saddles far from home. In the margins, Ezekiel began to code the work with a farmer's pride. Fresh bodies were green harvest. Preserved forms were cured crop. A woman of childbearing age, prized for teaching, became spring grain. A child with an unusual spine knotted lumber. The valley prospered. The Ashworths lived modestly and bought land everywhere. They gave picnics among the graves twice a year and organized cleanups where children chased one another between stones that marked no one at all. When the road east demanded more, the brothers turned ambitious and particular. Doctors ordered characteristics as if ordering lengths of cloth. A muscular youth for one professor, an elderly case of consumption for another. Female cadavers, underrepresented. Ezekiel, with immaculate penmanship, logged each request and its fulfillment next to amounts that grew into a fortune measured in other people's names. People came and went through Ashworth Creek and called it a godly place. They sent for Ezekiel when neighboring settlements wanted advice on consecrating ground. They wrote letters quoting Zechariah's sermons. Morai trained apprentices who learned his joints, not his true trade. When danger appeared, a merchant who smelled what he should not from a crate's seam, a doctor suspicious of the number of sudden illnesses, danger rarely lived long. The ledger's numbering slipped past 200, past 3. On one tremoring page, a name is only the new doctor. He died of a fever no one could diagnose. There is a grave for him in Death Valley where, for once, a body actually lies. So it continued, season after season, until a woman's stubborn hope pried up the valley's lid. Her name was Elizabeth Caldwell, newly married to a prosperous farmer, James. In October of 1820, he stopped at the chapel on his way to Virginia and sat under Zechariah's voice. 2 weeks later, on the way home, he did the same and disappeared. Elizabeth waited until October 15th, the day he had promised, then set to tracing him as if mapping a river. Letters to postmasters, notes carefully copied, dates and weather. An orderly grief. The news came back in simple lines. Seen at Ashworth Creek, attended service, shared a meal, departed at dusk. She saddled her anger and rode. Zechariah received her with softness. Yes, they had seen James. Yes, a fine Christian man. Yes, he had left before dark. It might have ended there had Morai not paled when she spoke her name. That color draining from his face, uncontrolled, unblessed, was a splinter she could not ignore. Elizabeth took a room at the inn. She asked questions in a voice that suggested she already knew the answers. A boy mentioned a chestnut horse tied behind the brothers' house well after nightfall on October 9th. Confronted, Zechariah smiled a second story. James had forgotten his gloves. He returned briefly, then left again. Elizabeth went to the magistrate Jacob Turner and laid out facts like lengths of lace. He was reluctant to tug at the brothers' standing. Respectability has a kind of armor until someone remembers to test the buckles. Elizabeth asked for a letter authorizing exhumations along her husband's route, so that if he had died, his body could come home. With that paper in her pocket, she returned to the chapel and asked to see the graves of travelers buried recently. "For my peace," she said, "if not for your own." Turner balked, citing custom and winter ground. Zechariah frowned about God's displeasure. Morai muttered about frost. But grief is contagious. Martha Tunney, the widow of one of Death Valley's earliest burials, lifted her head. "Let the woman look," she said. "I would want the same." On a hard morning in December, men with spades opened 3 graves in the section where the poor and unknown were said to lie. The air smelled of iron and damp root. When Morai pried up the first lid, the truth made a sound like wind leaving a room. Rocks in linen, sand in shroud, weight as lie. The other 2 offered the same theater. "If thieves stole bodies," Elizabeth asked, calm as a hinge, "why dress stones like saints and tuck them in the dirt?" Turner turned to the brothers, and their faces told him what the graves already had. He set guards on their door. That night, the Ashworths lit their house from inside and left by a path only they knew, a wagon creaking under boxes packed long ago for a departure they had always expected. The fire spilled into the undertaking room and found the trap door. When the men bucketed water into the smoke and finally stumbled down the steep dirt steps, they entered the truth the community had paid for with trust. One chamber held instruments and clear liquids labeled in a hand that loved neatness. The second sawdust 5 bodies in stages of waiting. One wore a gold ring the widow named before she touched it. James laid back his head and said nothing at all. The third room contained the books. In the days that followed, names were matched to rumors, numbers to faces, and faces to the blank stones under the pines. Riders galloped to Lexington and back with legal men and a physician who studied the preservation like a scholar admiring penmanship. Families came with flowers for empty ground. Martha Tunney, who had for 36 years spoken to soil under which no one listened, wept without raising her voice. The investigators made lists of the complicit, the doctors and professors and officials who had purchased ignorance with coin, and most of those names escaped punishment behind influence and distance. The brothers themselves vanished into the wet distances of a frontier that swallowed men and spit back only stories. A preacher in Tennessee with Zechariah's eyes, an undertaker in Pennsylvania with Ezekiel's hands, 3 strangers running a small church in Missouri. Death Valley changed its name to Providence, as if a new word could bleach the old stain. Families exhumed the boxes they had paid for and found, almost everywhere, the clean treachery of stone. In the Appalachian hills, customs hardened. Long wakes, the body never alone. Men sitting up beside graves with lanterns so the night could not steal what daylight had given back. Laws thickened around medical colleges. Still, the hunger for cadavers found new cracks to pour through. The ledgers went to shelves in the Historical Society, and for a while the story eased into footnotes. When the road crew's shovel woke the box in 1918, another hand, mine now, turned pages the first investigators had missed. The 17th book was different. It held maps, thin as veins, to caches of money salted away in the folds of hills. It recorded correspondence to Europe, shipments that ended in Edinburgh and Paris. It carried Ezekiel's colder catechism, written in a summer hand months before the fire. We have trained more physicians than any professor who stands above board at a lectern. If their skill saves lives, count those saved against those taken. Find your accounting there. He wrote also of imitators, 7 by my count, who asked for recipes and routes, for the proper ratios of alcohol and salt, for advice on how to keep a face open to a weeping widow while the rest of you lived in the dark. Elizabeth Caldwell stayed. She took the portion of her husband's estate the law allowed her, and built a school in Lexington where children learned letters cleanly and, when they were older, the ethics of what a man may do in the name of progress. She never remarried. In 1860, gray-haired and unsentimental, she gave an interview. "People ask if I'm proud," she said. "I am not. I am only stubborn. I would not be lied to. If there is mercy in any of it, it is that reforms followed, and fewer wives had to argue with the ground. The pines have grown thicker over the years, and the chapel's white has long since peeled away into weather. Somewhere in those trees a single stone still stands. Here lie the victims of man's inhumanity to man. 1784, 1821. It marks a mass grave that holds strangers together the way the ledgers held them apart. I close the last book, and the room seems colder for a moment, as if the cellar air has risen into the present. It is tempting to believe the worst stories are aberrations, that the Ashworths were a blight peculiar to their time, that we are better now, that trust cannot be so expertly counterfeited. But paper is patient, and cemeteries are quiet, and men still wear faces like masks when the work requires it. If history teaches anything here, it is not only that evil can hide in the chapel pew and the carpenter's shop, but that it thrives wherever need invites denial. In Death Valley, grief built a gate. 3 brothers learned the lock. A nation's hunger for knowledge turned the key.